everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This is 724th episode. We will discuss on circular economy. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. David Schumacher, Madam Ali Rice, and very famous entrepreneur, Mr. Mike. So he's a very gentleman, and soon he gonna solve uh, the emerging economy problem. And definitely we have our another speaker, Mr. David Smith. First, I would like to give chance Mr. David Schumacher to discuss on circular economy.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sharif, and good morning to the rest of the fine panel assembled here as we talk about circular economy today. I suppose probably be a good idea to define what we're talking about. So, as usual, jump back into the dictionary. And the dictionary definition says an economic system based on the reuse and regeneration of materials and products, especially as a means of circulating production in a sustainable and an environmentally friendly way. So that's probably a good definition to start with, and we'll see where we take the definition from there as we progress. So, I mean, who can argue about that? Who can argue about the idea of trying to reuse, reincorporate? I mean, when you look at manufacturing and so forth, a big part of that is in search of raw materials for the manufacturing. So if we already have those in some form or fashion, it'd be great if we could put them back into the manufacturing stream. Of course, they're just like everything in life. There are complications and other considerations. Sometimes something that's already been processed is much more difficult, more costly to reuse than it is to go and extract new from the ground or wherever it is that we get these materials. So it takes then an emphasis of wanting to do that to be able to complete this circular cycle of taking products and putting them back into production in another way. So how do we do that? Well, some of that's been done already. I mean, on the surface, it makes sense. There seems to be pretty good public acceptance and even public pressure onto corporations to do such a thing. And that plays out in a number of different ways, either minimizing what gets used in the manufacturing process, looking at how the extraction process, how that treats the earth, because the public putting this pressure back on the corporations, in some degree anyway, rewards companies that are more responsible, for lack of a better term, than others at doing this sort of thing, because it makes sense. We've accepted the idea. This is actually a good thing, I think, because I think this is an ethics vehicle for us. And what I mean by an ethics vehicle is it's great to sit down as a philosopher and say, well, I think the ethics of this situation is this, because of this, because of this. But practical ethics is how it plays out in life and how we want to put those ideas forward. So pressure onto corporations, pressure onto mining, and so forth helps in this regard. One last thing I'll say about ethics when we talk about ethics, because really that's what this cycle is about, is we need to balance action versus inaction, or the proactionary principle that I've talked about here, the cost of doing nothing, and the precautionary principle, the cost of rushing in without sufficient information. So those two need to be balanced. And maybe this public forum, pressure on the producers, pressure on society in general is a good way to go about this, informing this circular economy. So today, that's what I want to advocate for. I'll leave the business processes and aspects for others to talk about. Thank you, Dr. Sharif.
Thank you, Madam Ali Rice.
Okay, so I'm really conscious about reusing, reducing, recycling, and generally in the UK, we're expected to actually organise our recycling so it's collected and separated. And So I think that's a great thing. But I know my mum's best friend lives in Germany, and years ago when we used to go and visit her, maybe 40 plus years, they used to recycle then, and recycling over here has really only kicked in the last kind of 20 years. And there's also there's also some dubious stuff that goes on, so that you sort all your recycling, and quite often there's stories about it going to landfill. And there was a huge story not so long ago. So the plastic waste, we were actually taking our plastic bags back to supermarkets, and there was this huge documentary about how they were taking all our plastic waste and shipping it 6,500 miles away back to Malaysia, and it was being stored in these open areas and polluting. So I think the thing is that we want, you know, we want people to be honest about what they're doing. So I don't understand why we should recycle if on the end point they're not doing what they're saying they're going to do, when we pay council tax for councils to do what they say they're going to do. So waste management's really important. I think kind of the fashion industry, there's a huge throwaway culture, particularly in the West. And I think it was the Aral Sea was pretty much taken down to nothing because of the cotton industry. And the fashion industry, the West was responsible for that kind of lack of water and pollution in an area that, you know, isn't even geographically ours. But I think it was just so that we could achieve cheap fashion that people could spend a few pounds on and throw away. So I think, and for me, it's really, you know, it's really amazing that there is, you know, like eBay and Vinted, that there's a circular economy. So people sell their unwanted things that you know, they've grown tired of, but they're still in good quality, and other people can kind of purchase them and get good quality products for much less money. So I think the way that people shop and you know, and do things has changed. So and I think that the other thing as well is rethinking what happens as well. So yeah, the fact that Uber makes use of people that have already got transport, and it kind of makes that kind of link, so that, you know, we enable things to happen, and the companies kind of join the dots and kind of make something happen, so that it brings the user and the facilitator together. So I think that's kind of where we need to go, really, so that we're working in a sustainable way. And it does make sense to kind of do things in an ethical way for all of us. So it's, you know, there's a win-win for nature, for the planet, for people, and you know, but there's still huge room for improvement. So and obviously we drive vehicles, and there's pollution, there's huge amounts of forest that are being taken away, and environmental loss kind of around the world, and particularly in developing countries as well. And the knock-on effect of that's kind of something that will affect us all as well. So I think you know, there's still massive routes forward, but it does make sense to, you know, when I was growing up, we always had a milkman. And a milkman's a perfect way of showing the circular economy. So you had the milk bottles delivered in the morning, they collect them the following day, and then you know, they'd be refilled. And you know, most of the milk that we get nowadays is in huge, you know, like 4-litre bottles. So yeah, so there's some things that haven't improved because of convenience, and others that have. So yeah, and for me, I think people, you know, so I've got 2 children, and I use biodegradable nappies all the way through both of their kind of their nappy days. And I think I was part of this environmental entrepreneurs. So it was a course at Keele University, and nappies are one of the worst things that go in landfill. And they got to stage that they could actually aggregate for roads, because the nappies were so, you know, they took, I think it's like 30 or 40 years to degrade. So I think that kind of consciousness from the manufacturer, I think people should be responsible. So when they manufacture things, they have to have some kind of way of either degrading or recycling. Otherwise, they shouldn't produce what they produce. So yes, for me, you know, I just kind of stick with the Green Party. You know, that it really does kind of come down to that there either needs to be new use for it, or it needs to be able to have something done with it. So yeah, so I think it's really important.
Looks like I'll go next. I'm Mike Stanley from TransitX, and we're building a new infrastructure for transportation. But I also have sort of the practical, because we have to really be honest for ourselves, like, why don't we have a circular economy, and what are the barriers to that? And you asked the question, David, who would be against it? It's like pretty much the status quo, who wants to do business as usual. They want to. We know that the top companies are actively in concert trying to, prevent progress in this. They'll write reports. They'll fund research studies that support their position. They'll fund disinformation campaigns, and the governments are really not equipped to really deal with that. There's this sort of the status quo companies will fund deregulation. Like, we don't want to be regulated. We don't want to, how dare you tell us how to do things? We're in the business of shareholder profits, and how do we make more money, and the commercial aspects. So I think that's part of the reality, and how do you sort of counter that? And I think, because consumers make short-term purchasing decisions, right? They go to the store and they'll basically buy the cheaper one. And unless all these negative externalities, if the real cost, not just the cost to the corporation, but the cost to the ecology and the nature, unless that is factored in. So, like, for example, I'll go and I'll read that, I don't know, a pair of blue jeans will take 200 gallons of water to produce. That's not a fact. I'm just sort of saying, like, you'll see these things. You'll see that a cow takes so many tons of grain and so many tons of water for a pound of beef or something. Well, why isn't then that cost factored into the cost of the product, right? Because we're going to have a circular economy. I think one of the key things is, how does a government be able to, in the world, how do we force companies to really have a fair market? And a fair market has to be valuing all of these externalities. So, is it something that is good for the environment? So, if those plastic bags are actually going 6,000 miles, that should be factored into the cost of the plastic bag. So, and it's not. So we can't have consumers making rational choices, because the price is not the real price. And commercial enterprises, they have an obligation. It's actually in their bylaws. They have most companies have an obligation to maximize shareholder profits. And so we're really, I'm not sure what the solutions are, but those are some of the issues that I see. Thank you. And then why don't I, because Sharif isn't here, how about David Smith? I'll pass the torch.
Thank you. We've all been on this enough. We know the process. The circular economy is a fantastic topic to talk to in what we're doing. And a circular economy really keeps the materials, product, and services in circulation for as long as possible. And there is some very interesting nuances to that as you look at it around the world, with different informations going there, because, like, the EPA has an act that's called Save Our Seas, which uses a system-focused approach. You look at what the United Nations doing, it has a slightly different view of how to use this is going forward. And then you look at many other organizations and you see the same type of thing. The big difference as you look at some of this is that the process begins with, what are the raw materials and how do we extract them? How do we manufacture? What's retail? How's consumption? How do we recycle? And how do we keep that all in a closed loop going together, and being able to do things like that? And the circular approach of it, it really tries to reduce material use, redesigns product and services to look there. And again, equally important is the recapture as we go through it, and how can we do it, and why is it important there? And it's an important part of slowing climate change, and we have to take action to do that, and hit the different elements of that. The circular economy, to me, is one that we've tried at times to do parts of it, and the economics to it were not in place at the time. And what we're seeing now is a move to where economics are changing. We're seeing supply chain disruptions beginning to make parts of it more important, and many other different areas there as well. So let me begin there, and let me pass over to you, Rob, for the next part.
Sure. So circular economy, a lot of underlying concepts. Ali's point on the world being much more circular when we were kids is a good one. Back when I was growing up as well, we had milk delivery, glass bottles were washed and reused, Coke bottles and soda bottles were washed and reused. We didn't have as much waste being produced. And one of the things that changed was plastics. Plastics got really cheap. And it became cheaper to discard this stuff than it was to reuse it, and the cost in landfills was seen as negligible. The ocean-borne plastics thing hadn't become an issue yet, and there was nobody paying money to clean that stuff up. It was like you could just dump garbage into the ocean forever, and it wasn't going to make a difference. And of course we've learned now it does make a difference. And we've badly polluted our seafood supply. So as a result, so now we get it. Now we get that we're polluting the world with our waste, but we've become tied very, very closely to the production of addicted to petrochemicals, and getting off petrochemicals is a problem. There's an ad running here in the United States. Just hit the market recently, where it showcases all the things you'd lose if you suddenly turned off the petrochemical market, the perfumes, the hair colorings, it's really in almost everything that we do, there's some aspect of petrochemical waste, and plastics was a spinoff of refining oil. So you cut down oil refining. Plastics, if you still produce them, are going to get quite a bit more expensive, or they would be eliminated entirely. And we would again have to think about other materials, but that's exactly what we should do. So going back to Mike's comment, the issue right now is the economics are screwy. The pollution that's being caused, the cost of the pollution being caused is not being incurred by the companies that are causing it. And if we fix that one thing, we would likely be able to improve the overall rate of, or at least reduce the overall rate of pollution substantially, because companies will work to reduce costs. But if they're not incurring a cost, if they're able to do something and the cost of that is passed on to others, then they're not really motivated to fix it. Now, having said that, people are through their buying choices tending to prefer products that are greener over products that are not. Companies that I work with claim upwards of $3 billion of revenue tied to their green efforts. By being green, they're capturing customers and closing deals that they wouldn't close if they weren't as effective at reducing the pollution they're producing. But we're not talking circular economy yet. Not any place. The old days of the milk bottles have gone away, and outside of some Central American countries, we're not doing much with regard to recycling glass bottles either. We crush them, but more often than not, the stuff we throw into recycling bins are still ending up in the landfills. The plastics are a joke. The plastic industry really kind of got the idea that people were more form over function. And so they regularly stamp plastic stuff like it's recyclable, and it's not. Our ability to recycle plastics is very limited, and there are entire classes of plastics we can't deal with. And one of the big issues is if one of the plastic types that cannot be recycled gets mixed in with one of the plastic types that can be recycled, and those things are batched together, it destroys the batch. So suddenly you carry a tremendous amount of risk when you're trying to recycle plastics, because you can go through all the expense of trying to do it to find that the entire batch has been contaminated by a piece of plastic that got into the mix that contaminated it. China used to be the great dumping ground for a lot of this stuff, but then I think the tipping point was New York throwing a lot of used baby diapers into the mix, and so you had these big amounts of plastics and waste with degrading baby poop going over to China, and you can just kind of imagine they weren't real fans of this, and so we were actually polluting the very stuff we wanted the other folks to recycle, because we figured China was like that kid in that old cereal commercial. They'd eat anything. And they said, yeah, no, we're not doing that. And so they don't. And now you've got major recycling efforts. They're trying to figure out what to do with a lot of this stuff that was supposedly going to be recycled. And it's not. And the thing is, it wasn't being recycled in China either. We're just going into dumps, and they ended up in the ocean. And so we weren't fixing the problem. We were just moving up from one geography to another. In fact, a good chunk of the emerging countries out there have just become dumping grounds for waste, which is turning their arable land into land you can't grow anything on, and you wouldn't want to live on either. It's just highly polluted. And there's no upside to this. We're moving the problem around. We're not fixing the problem. So if we are truly serious about circular economy and fixing the planet, the very first thing we need to do is charge the companies that are polluting the planet for cleaning up the pollution that they cause. If you contain the total cost of a particular product in that product, either that product will then rise or fail on its merits. While right now we're effectively subsidizing polluters. And we seem to be surprised that they're continuing to pollute. We need to remove those subsidies, the effective subsidies. We need to charge companies to clean up the pollution they cause. We attempt to do that with oil companies. When there's a big oil spill, we do charge back the oil companies to attempt to clean that up. But remember, it's never 100%. And we remember the big oil spill we had here in the United States in the Mexican Gulf. A good chunk of that spilled oil is still floating around at the base of that Mexican Gulf in toxic ponds and rivers. That was never cleaned up, and BP was almost bankrupted by the cleanup that they did do. And it just showcases the amount of tolerance we seem to have for extreme waste. With the United States, we also had a pipeline that was going to go in from Canada to the coast of the United States, carrying dirty crude, and it was going to carry dirty crude across some of the largest aquifers in the country. And the folks that are promoting it saying, it's never going to leak. Part of the pipeline was completed. It has leaked. The really screwy thing about this pipeline is it benefited Canadian refiners, and we don't refine dirty crude in the United States. It didn't benefit at all. It was for transshipment out of the country. It just provided a cheaper transshipment point to refineries in third world countries that were more tolerant of waste and pollution. So it made no sense at all from either an economic or an energy conservation kind of standpoint, which is how it was presented. It was just a total toxic mess, and yet one party just advocated for this thing like it was going to be the God's gift to jobs, and really the only jobs that we're sustaining were maintenance jobs that were going to be few in number. It would create a lot of jobs to build the pipeline, but once built, those jobs all go away. So in the end, it made no sense. Yet it was heavily backed, both in and outside the government, to make it happen. And that means the government just isn't doing. It often aren't doing. In this case, it did. Eventually, the government blocked the pipeline, and it didn't happen. But so often that's not the outcome. The economic interests are the ones that prevail, and then the underlying risks are not mitigated. So making people pay for the harm that they cause is probably the only way to assure we move to something like a circular economy. If companies have to pay for the waste that they create, they will find ways to reduce the waste much more aggressively than they are now. Yes, they're getting more business.
Let's take that and let's take that as a good question, as a good starting part for the rest. Like, what are we going to do to get to the circular economy? What are the barriers? And everyone take 2 minutes to go around. Let's start with David.
Oh, thanks, Mike. I don't think anybody voted you leader, but I appreciate that. So fair enough. I'll go ahead and pass over to David.
Well, cooperation, perhaps that's part of the solution. So we saw a little bit of it there between Mike and Rob, and perhaps the rest of us as we go. So let me start off by saying thanks to Mike talking about the way that top companies are participating, trying to maintain their status quo, and we humans tend to want to maintain our status quo unless we're moved to do something else. And I think Allie's comments about the milk bottles, I think Rob's comment about recycling plastic, all fall into these regards. Consumers, we're the ones that buy the products. So it's got to be consumer attitude that changes to change this. It's how we would change government. It's how we would change the behavior of companies. And it's hard. It's obviously very hard, or would have been done by now. So how does this get done? By seeing the connections in daily life. When I can see the connection of something that comes back and affects me in daily life, then I move to participate in government action, perhaps. I am moved to select different companies. The power of the pocketbook is where it's at. But you're right, there's disinformation, there's a lot of things to cloud this. I think that this connection with daily life can best be taken advantage by entrepreneurial opportunity. We've seen that with electric vehicles. We've seen that with other disruptive technologies out there. Where are cab companies today compared with rideshare and so forth? So I think this entrepreneurial activity brings it into the sphere of daily life so that it's something that's on our mind. And we've got entrepreneurs that are telling us, sure, from their standpoint to promote their companies, what's truly going on with plastic, what's truly going on with recycling, what's truly the costs. And if they can provide a solution that I'm willing to participate in as a consumer, then that advocacy grows even larger. So I think this whole idea of disruptive technology has to be an element of getting to the circular economy. Otherwise, we are stuck in the status quo. And I don't know how that is for 2 minutes, but I'll pass it to Ollie.
Okay, well, because I think I don't really understand the differences in plastics, and I don't know how difficult it is to recycle plastic and reuse it again. But people must know, and I think one of the problems that's happening is we diligently sort our plastics and send it, assuming that it's going to be recycled, but we don't know it is. So I think the thing is that there's kind of a lack of trust and transparency, I think, in what happens. So we act in good faith, but what happens doesn't necessarily kind of turn out the way we think it does. So and I think the Earthshot Prize, I think Prince William's involved in that. One of the things, I think alternatives to plastic, so plastics that degrade, I think there's one that they've just kind of innovated, that I think it's seaweed originally from origin, but it's kind of strong and durable, and then it disintegrates after a certain length of time, particularly in water. So I think and I know so I used to spend quite a lot of time in Malaysia before I had my kids. So the last time I was there, I was pregnant with Koti, and he's almost 18. But I think one of the things that happened actually culturally, I don't know whether they still do, but in Malaysia they used to drink out of bags, so they used to use plastic bags, and then they used to have their drink in the plastic bag, and then use straws. And then at that time, the infrastructure wasn't there for waste management. So at one point, I saw them just kind of landfilling, just using a JCB digger thing to just put waste right next to the sea, the river that was right next to the sea. And I think we stayed on a 5-star resort, and we were doing this environmental project. But the biggest difference, is even then, is that the beach where the hotel was pristine. But as soon as they got to the public beach, there was waste all over it, including, dirty nappies that were, So I think the thing is that, I would argue that in the West, we really haven't got any excuse, to be honest, that we're not taking care of it. But nobody's pushed the companies to be responsible to do that. And I think I'm definitely conscious of what happens, but obviously that's, you know, one person only has a certain bets. But what we choose to buy, it's like when I buy shampoos, when I buy you know, washing detergent, everything that I use is this Ecova brand that's good for the planet. And you know, I look at the shelves and there's this little tiny section with this eco stuff, and everyone else kind of willy-nilly buys stuff that's got all these chemical things in it. And a lot of people don't give any thought to what happens to, you know, when that goes in the water source. So I think the thing is, how do we make other people more conscious about what they do and the kind of the impact that their choices have? So it's really tough.
Great, thanks, Ali. I'll say, I mean, one of the issues is that there are innovations like the seaweed wrappers and other things, but right now, because the cost of the pollutants is not factored in, it looks like it's higher cost, right? And so that was the thing that David had, you know, plastics are cheap, right? And so unless we sort of fix that balance, consumers are not going to be looking at that little aisle and that little corner that says, okay, it's good for the planet. And it's even hard to determine whether it actually is good for the planet, because it's hard. There's no good rating agencies. So, and I think the other is that, let's say there is a innovation that comes out of entrepreneurship or startup, just getting that where it can be scaled up. And there's very lack of resources, financial funding to be able to scale up a promising technology to commercialization, because you have these large companies that dominate and they don't want to be disrupted. And so they're going to basically, you know, try to prevent that at all costs. And so part of that, then it gets into like misinformation, that it's easy to start a misinformation campaign. People are doom scrolling and just getting bad information. It's hard to you know, see what's actually fact versus not fact. And so there's a lot of challenges, and I'm not sure if the government is really equipped to handle this. I know it sort of started to go downhill when we said didn't have to be balance of news, and now everyone is basically in this echo chamber, including us, right? We're sort of, you know, think, oh, okay, yeah, circular economy, it's all good, we should all do it. And it's like, no, the 99% of the world doesn't think that way. You know, most people, you know, well, the majority of the world doesn't even have like running water and stuff and basic stuff. And in the westernized economy, most people don't give it. And you have, you know, news outlets that are basically actively discouraging, you know, anything that's environmental or even efficiency. It's like you're saving electricity. It's like, oh, that's a woke thing. Or it's like, it's just so bad. It's hard to fathom on how bad it is. So hopefully we can, and I don't have great solutions for that other than like seeing if we can make progress with the government. But David, why don't you, what's your thoughts?
Well, I agree that the lack of people understanding the importance for this is one of the major challenges you see in a circular economy. And we've talked about this so many times when we've talked about COP and other things around the whole environmental issue. The average citizen doesn't see how what they can do can have any impact to affect the overall challenge there. And so education at all levels, from early kids in early childhood to senior citizens who have a big impact on this, companies, governments, non-government organizations, funders, all need to be educated more about how the impact can be there, how the circular economy can be a real interesting impact with it. You know, if properly built, though, the circular economy should really focus on avoiding the recycling stage. It should really prevent waste from being created in the first place. And many folks in other, particularly some of the large NGOs, that's the approach that they are proposing, is to really build it right, look at the different areas, and we're seeing that. You know, for example, a great example is that if I look at the electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are being promoted as a way to deal with the environment. But when I look at an electric vehicle in the term of a circular economy, it's all wrong. You know, the cost of the battery to replace it when it goes out, it exceeds the cost of the car frame that's left over. The material trying to dispose of the battery in an electric vehicle presents all types of problems. The environment around it becomes a throwaway economy, and it's a throwaway car, as opposed to one that can be taken and used in a circular economy approach. So it's a great example of what's not to be there and what could you do there. And I believe that's very important as you look at it. But a circular economy really challenges us to consider waste and pollution almost as design flaws and how that works and how you're going to see those places. And the other is, how do we look at taking the circular economy and how do we make it into a regenerative process where we plan the ways to transform it as we go it. So I've been brought up through manufacturing and others, and a design for manufacturability. And design for manufacturability in the semiconductors and others is a very important concept. But as we look at the circular economy, we need to also put into that area is design for a circular economy approach. And that's almost the only way to begin to get it working, because the barriers are not that it's not a good thing to do. The biggest barrier is most people don't see why they should do it. Why can they have an impact? Could they do other things like that? And the lack of education and the lack of the average person seeing that impact, the average executive seeing that impact. What can my company do? I'm a small piece of it. And the lack of understanding of what are the options at each of the 5 stages of the circular economy, and not seeing the view as a system. It just isn't going to happen if we cannot get over those education barriers. So, Mike, that's my comment.
Great. No, thank you. And one point. So somebody I know, Dave Finnegan in Florida, he created this book for kids called Green Actioneers. And it's just wonderful. It says, like, about efficiency and conservation and other things. He cannot get any curriculum into the school system. It is so locked down and saying, like, no, you can't hand this off. You can't. So there are big barriers to education. But let's move over to it's like, do any of us know of either the people or companies or groups or organizations that seem to be moving things in the right direction? Should we, where should we be looking for the leaders in this space, or who should take leadership? Rob, do you want to start us up on that?
Sure. Of the companies I cover, HP is probably the strongest when it comes to circular economy. They also had the biggest problem. Their printing industry was going through massive amounts of paper. The ink cartridges were ending up in landfills and in oceans, and they recognized that they had to fix this. So they implemented an ink recycling program. Now, when you buy ink, you get a pouch, and you have a choice. You can either throw out the ink cartridge when you're done, or you can send it back to HP, where 92% of it is recycled and put into other things. The paper now comes from renewable forests that are designed to do paper, and they're looking at other materials like hemp as renewable materials like hemp, which properly degrade much like wood pulp does, and isn't doing damage to the environment. And the end result is they've gone far farther than anybody else. They just recently released a line of consumer printers that don't use cartridges at all, that use reservoirs, and kind of showcasing if you remove the thing that's causing the problem entirely and use a different technology, then the problem to a large extent goes away. Now, you still have to think about recycling the equipment, but they do that as well. They went into a partnership with Dell, and much of the stuff that they produce goes back to if it's returned to them, and that's a big if it's returned to them, goes back to a plant back east, and it's taken down to its component parts and recycled. Dell has a concept that is market leading, hasn't made it to market yet, called Project Luna. And they took a laptop computer and completely reconceived it as something that could be taken apart very quickly. The non-recyclable parts were minimized and centralized, and all the recyclable parts are put in a place so it's easy and it can be easily and cheaply recycled. In fact, they recently demonstrated that you could put a robot in someplace like Best Buy, take your laptop in, slide it in a slot, and that robot for a fee would upgrade it, would change it, or would take it apart and recycle it, depending on what it is you wanted to have done. And it would be done right at the location, your local Best Buy, as opposed to having to send it back to some central recycling concept or plant. The issue is, though, it's an expensive ramp because you have to put in the robots. There isn't a cost for going to the modular design. They'd have to occur in manufacturing, and people would have to be willing to pay extra because Dell's not going to go to zero margins or negative margins for this. So in the end, people would have to be excited about the recycling aspect. And I argued at the time, and still do, that the way to sell this is not on the recycling side. The right way to sell this is on, hey, you can upgrade your laptop, not replace it. No buyer's remorse. If you didn't buy something, you can go back in, and for a marginal fee, you can get that feature that you didn't think you needed, but you discovered you wanted, without replacing the entire laptop computer. In other words, focus on the other benefits as aggressively as the ecological benefits, and you get both. And that's probably where we need to look at here, is finding ways to incent the user to use the technology regardless of the ecological impacts. If there's enough secondary benefit, then the user's motivated to make the change. If it's all about just saving the planet, it really depends on how valuable the user feels about that, and your impact's going to be far less. So those are the examples that I have.
Okay. And so taking that, like, are there organizations that we should be looking at that can help create that circular marketplace, or that have ideas on that? And I'll just open that up to anyone. Are there, what organizations are there that are really taking the right approach to this, and that people should be aware of? Anybody?
Well, there are large. I mean, there are companies that's all they do is work in this area. I don't have the names of them memorized. But for instance, the HP and Dell example I gave, they established a partnership with a large firm that's located in the Midwest that handles recycling for a crap ton of companies. So there are green companies, and that's all they do. You can just look them up. Green companies, that's all they do is they assist with recycling. They can help you with your recycling plans. But they can even step in and help you design this stuff, because they know what they have to do to take things apart. And so they can advise you on how to build them so they're more easily deconstructed.
Right. So I think one of the challenges, how do you get companies then to use these services? Because unless they're not financially incentivized, it's going to be hard to get them to do that. I think, from my perspective is that let's say there are new technologies that can be used for doing, better plastics, better recycling, better circularity, but they're not at scale. And I think it's actually the role of the government, just like we had low-cost loans for renewable companies or solar or car companies, that I think the government needs to actually help, because I think there's this gap between a prototype and the first commercial system, and we're just not able to, it's not structured. You have your VCs, your venture capitalists on one side, and then you have your project investors, and they need to see a first commercial implementation before they can apply capital. And so I think part of it is just capital allocation for seeing these new technologies to be real and to be commercialized. So anybody else, and then we'll maybe have start to wrap up in like 4 minutes here. And
Well, let me pop in with the idea about benefit corporations, B Corps. I think there's some advantage there. Me as a consumer, I want to do the right thing. I want to feel good about my purchases. I want to participate where I think that I'm helping. But how do you do that? Do I spend all day analyzing every product, every purchase? No, that's not the way people work. If I can direct my money towards companies that have some type of certification for providing benefit, it goes back into this idea of the circular economy and beyond, and it makes it easier for me to do. Now, let me say that clearly there are challenges there. When I last looked, there was only about 3,500 certified B Corps. Maybe there's more now, okay? But even so, that number is small compared to all the corporations that are out there. So incentive to go into that area still comes back to public pressure, public approval. And I don't think we can leave it to government. Government should help. I don't think we should leave it to the altruism of companies. But if we reward those that are going in the direction we want, that make it easier for me to make responsible purchases and so forth, then that's going to help. So I can eat my Ben & Jerry's ice cream. They're on that list. I can get my glasses from Warby Parker, Patagonia, great for clothes and so forth. But right now, these are like a showcase, and it needs to be something that's expansive that we take for granted. So this is something that can help, something that can drive us in a direction that we want to be driven to make it easier for each of us to do the right thing. My comments.
Yeah, I think B Corp is a good way. I think that B Corps, most corporations, just if people don't know, it's for shareholders and for profits, and that sort of drives a lot of the who you hire and who the directors are. And the B Corps, generally, I'm just overgeneralizing, is that they consider the whole economy and they consider the environment. It's a much more broad. It's not just in the interest of shareholders. So I think, yes, I think B Corps is, I don't even know who the biggest B Corp is, because I get most of them are very small because they haven't been around. But yes, if we can get some major companies to sort of say, hey, it's not just in the interest of shareholders, but you almost have to be brought up from the beginning from that. Any other comments?
Well, it's kind of interesting to look at the countries that are the most green versus the ones that are the least green. I think there's an opportunity here because we have to kind of get the governments on board with this, and we are a competitive race. And if we could make this chase for green be much more competitive against countries, between the countries, then we might be able to make better progress. The other thing is, if we look at the top three most green, or top four greenest countries, Sweden, Denmark, United Kingdom, and Finland, three of those are also in the top 5 happiest countries in the world, suggesting that there may be a connection between the happiness of the population and the behavior of the government acting beneficially towards that population. Again, I think people would like to be happy and content, and connecting the behaviors together to reach a more overarching benefit would clearly showcase that there's a reason to become green, and part of that reason is just a better overall life, and it might drive behavioral change.
Good point. How do they actually? Any thoughts on, like, how are they ranking them? Is it is there is an international standard for circularity, or is it the green index, or is it I don't know. I assume there's somebody has some metrics, or maybe there's multiple metrics that you can use to rank groups. Because I do know.
I'll put a link to the report in the deal so you can see it.
Great. Because I think one of the challenges is that you look at maybe some of the greenest countries are the ones that just have very low economic output, right? You're looking at $2,000 a year median income, and they're green because they don't have plastics. They don't have, so I guess one of the, and I see one of the challenges that you have a lot of countries that aspire to be this polluting and wasteful. Not that they desire cars, they desire luxury, they desire things that other people have. And how do we make it where you aspire to the lower, where we don't associate green with having like not having enough or taking compromises or not having good life, right? I think there's people trying to persuade us to say, okay, green means that you're going to have to sacrifice. You can't eat meat, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't have oil, you can't have your air products and stuff. And that's just I think just a false narrative that is being perpetrated, and we just need to get off away from that.
Well, correcting misinformation is something that few governments seem to be doing well, and that's an ongoing problem. But again, in the rankings, the countries that are ranked in the top 10 include Ireland, include France, include the United Kingdom. Certainly not third world countries. If you look at the least green countries, however, you see Qatar, you see Iran, you see Turkey, you see Vietnam, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia. Countries that often have quite a bit of money and wealth, but where the governments tend to be a bit more autocratic, where the focus is less on the people and more on something else, and where the environments are typically environments you probably wouldn't want to live in. And so the difference, I think, in looking at the least green and the most green countries isn't one of lack of economic capability, because it looks like the least green companies fall into that group. But more along the lines of whether they had governments that are, for the people and by the people, as opposed to governments that are for themselves.
Okay, with that, we have about 9 minutes before the end. Should we do a round of a wrap up? What are the important takeaways or something that you've learned today? And why don't we start with David, Ali, David, Rob, and then and we'll call it an end here. So, David.
Yeah, thanks. So as we start our circular closure about the circular economy, sorry, couldn't help. We'll make our way around. I always enjoy topics like this. I like hearing about maybe some of the tougher aspects of what we need to do and why it's important to involve as many people as possible and to look head on straight into the challenges that are there before us. We heard about those challenges. I think we had also heard about perhaps some good ideas about how we do it. But we should not be naive and expect this to be something that's easy to accomplish or easy to move forward on. So it takes, I think, more than education. I think education is great. I'm a lifelong learner. I participate in education, but it takes bringing that down into daily life to really make changes. And that's what we've got to do. So people have to get there somehow. The idea is about making sure that all the costs and the products are associated. We have true free market. Those are valid. It talks about disinformation. Those are valid. But at the end of the day, it comes to us. What do we want? How do we prioritize it? And how do we balance that against daily life? And that's how we move forward. Thank you. Ali?
Okay, so I'm lucky enough to live in the Cotswolds, which is a really beautiful area. And I think one of the things for me is that our priority is to be in a healthy rural area where our kids are happy, and there's lots of, I think, keeping things local as well. That there's a farm that produces raw milk that you can go and buy bottles of milk and then take the bottles back, and so I think making choices so that local businesses benefit, and there's kind of a mutualism, I think. So I think it's kind of staying local and making sure you're supporting those businesses that obviously in turn kind of support you. And also just making those conscious decisions. So for me, buying stuff isn't about how much it costs. It's the quality is much more important to me, to be honest. And also that's the same with the food that we eat, you know. So we buy natural stuff and cook from scratch. We don't buy lots of processed food. And I think the thing is that kind of, I think that's kind of keeping it real, really. And it's not about convenience, really. It's about kind of doing things so that you kind of maximize the nutrition and the benefits to your family, really. So, and I think that kind of, that time and place. So I think, so maybe we should stop kind of, I think 2020 taught me a lot, actually, because I think we need to kind of try and find a little bit more time just to enjoy the moment, you know, instead of chasing our tails. And as you know, so my son goes to university in September or October, and I think the time between now and then is really precious. So I think, you know, that, so I think I go to a yoga regularly, and I think, you know, there's I think quality of experience is much more important, and kind of those connections. And I've got connections all over the world. My twin sister lives over in Texas, and I think, you know, one of the things is that we need to learn from where the best practice is, but kind of, but still make conscious decisions, because it's, you know, our choices that we make and the things we buy determine. If we didn't support the corporations that do the things that, you know, pollute the planet, they wouldn't have business. So the thing is that we need to kind of culturally kind of change the systems so that we're not supporting the, you know, the corporations that we don't agree with. So yeah, okay. And it's tricky.
Yeah, I come down to, like, if we need to make better decisions, both as companies need to make better decisions and consumers need to make better decisions, that we need to have better information. So if I sort of trace this back, a lot of it comes down to the misinformation that's out there. And I think that comes down to our companies that are feeding the population around the world information, which used to be called newspapers, and it used to be some ethics for, you know, reporting on information, that these companies are no longer responsible for the content that is shown to people. So people are doom scrolling, liking things that are false information. And there's a lot. So unless we solve that issue, unless we make companies that are providing the bad information responsible in some ways for the information that's being provided to people, I don't see how we can have good decisions, because you can't get the right information. It's just too much bad information that's out there. So I you know, a lot of things come down to sort of good decision making on from my worldview, and I think the circular economy is one of those. So, David Smith.
Well, I agree with your comments there, but let me throw a little cold water on the end of that. At Davos in Switzerland at the World Economic Forum, they released a report there called the Circular Gap Report 2023. And what they found in that is that the global economy is measured to only be 7.2% circular today. Excuse me. What's bad about that is when it was first calculated back in 2018, it was over 9% there. And so it's fallen back to the 7.2. And, you know, if you begin to look at that, that kind of says that it's not working, that our whole concept of this is not being populated across the companies, the governments, and the people to be involved in it. And again, I think, as we talked about, we see initiatives that are local in different areas that are having impacts. I know I'm very impressed with some of the circular economy initiatives in Brazil, particularly the ones around the rainforest and other areas like that. They have done tremendous good down there. And you see other examples of that as point solutions around the world. But we really have to begin to look and say, how can we implement this broader? How can we look at it on a global scale? How can we let the common citizens know how they can be part of it and how they can be involved with that? And until we begin to get that, it's always going to be a circular economy approach that we're always looking at, when is it going to take off? Because until the broader masses understand it, it's not going to achieve escape velocity to have a significant impact. If I were to plot this on a Fisher-Price curve, the S curve that we see so much in technology, it would still be below the point where the S curve starts curving up to the top of the S curve. So we're still below the point for a circular economy where it's entering into a stage of any type of distinctive growth at all. And for us to begin to pull this in that area, it's still going to take work and training and a lot of collaboration, because the circular economy is not one company doing something. It's not one consumer. It has to be done as a collaborative approach with multiple people working together with it. And it has to be thought of as an ecosystem and not just as a trend that we're trying to do to work today. And it has to have that system of systems view. So guys, thank you so much. It's something that we need to do, but right now we're below the point where it's moving into any type of true market acceptance. So that's my concluding comments.
Great, thanks, David. And Rob, final words before we wrap this up.
So I think we need to keep our eye on the goal. The goal is reducing waste. Circular economy is one path, and it doesn't need to be exclusive. We have other paths. One of them is to work on building things that properly degrade using materials that degrade appropriately, whether in the ocean or on land. Another is to develop science that causes the degradation itself. We have created in labs enzymes and animals that will chew up plastics and turn them into something that's far more biodegradable in the animal waste. However, with either of the two other paths, there are consequential damages that we have to be concerned about. What happens when we get a critical mass of these biodegradable plastics in one place? What does that material do to the local ecology? If we release animals that consume plastics, what happens if those animals break containment and start consuming other things? In other words, after their food supply is exhausted, what do they eat after that? A bunch of science fiction movies about creatures that do things like start consuming all plastics and create huge problems with regard to spread and destruction. And we do have to recognize that if we try to address this problem in any other way other than just not creating the waste in the first place, we do have secondary events that we have to be concerned about and make sure that we contain. So the path here still needs to be focused entirely on reducing waste. We've got a number of mechanisms, including circular economy, but the only way to assure that you can fix a problem without creating another one is by eliminating the waste right up front, which is where circular economy, I think, wins over the other approaches. But the other approaches would be viable in areas where circular economy doesn't work and where you're willing to take the risk associated with introducing these other methods. You still, though, need to look at those consequential damages and make sure that you can sustain them, because the last thing we want to do is replace one problem that we're struggling with another problem that could be even worse. And we do that on a fairly regular basis. So assuring that the end result is positive is part of the effort, and overall, it's the reduction of waste is the goal.
Thank
And
you.
Sharif, back to you to close off.
Yeah. Mr. Mike, you are host for today's session, so you go for concluding remarks and finish today's session.
I think I thanks for all the panelists. Thank you for allowing me to play host in Dr. Sharif's absence. So sorry if that was disruptive, but I have a certain way of doing things. So, but thank you, and we'll see a lot of folks in the future topic. So thanks everyone for their opinions, and we will work towards building a circular economy here.
Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you. Take care.